because of forecasting errors, that really hasn't been the case in this cycle. So in that regard, any extra data is helpful, but the COVID period was just one out of the book.
When you publish a really great story, you want as many people as possible to read it, and that's the thing. We're trying to, on some level, have our cake and eat it too by having audience revenue tantamount to a paywall, but also keeping the gates open.
Most Green voters, even though they say they hate Labor, they'll preference Labor over the coalition. So most of those 11% of Green voters will effectively be voting for Labor when it comes down to it.
Most of our customers are baby boomers, so they're people who have recently retired generally or are preparing for retirement. So
welcome to the Weekly Wrap, where we go over our top video stories from nbr.co.nz from the past week. First up, inflation is finally back in the key 1 to 3% target band after a long absence, and the Reserve Bank has now delivered 3 consecutive rate cuts to take some heavy pressure off the economy. Join us as Dollars and Cents debates whether the central bank can afford to be more flexible with its target band. Hello and welcome to Dollars and Cents. I'm Jonathan Mitchell. Well, it's the end of the year and the Reserve Bank has cut the official cash rate 3 consecutive times, thanks to headline inflation retreating back into the target band. But while domestic inflation remains high and international inflation volatility is set to continue, can the RBNZ afford to be more flexible about inflation targeting? To debate, ANZ Chief Economist Sharon Zollner, HSBC Chief Economist Paul Bloxham and Kiwibank Economist Sabrina Delgado. So first to you, Sabrina, how important is the 1 to 3% inflation target band?
Yeah, it's very important. Regardless of where the target band is, some places have a 2% target band, but the key thing is that we need a target band in place to sort of anchor inflation expectations around.
And Sharon?
Yeah, no, there's often people suggest that perhaps if we could just ease up a little bit on inflation and let the economy have a bit of breathing room, then we would get better outcomes. But of course, the problem is it's a repeat game. Where do you end up? If you let things slip and slide, then you might get a temporary boost, but overall you're going to end up in a situation where you've got higher inflation and no better growth to show for it at all. So a clear and credible target is the key. Of course, the New Zealand target has changed quite a bit through time. It was 0 to 2, then 0 to 3, then 1 to 3, then became more medium term. So these things can evolve, but they do have to be credible. And if you muck around with them too much, then I think there is a risk that you could compromise that.
Paul, what are your thoughts?
So I guess there are 2 key things that I see about an inflation targeting setup. The first one is price stability is very important for the way the economy operates. So you need to have a credible inflation target that you're looking to stabilize. Price stability is important for businesses to know how to set prices, households to know what wages to demand, and for certainty in the economy. And then the other thing that I think is really quite maybe underappreciated, but certainly the way that an inflation targeting regime works is you're using that inflation target as a primary way to know what to do to manage the cycle in the economy. If the inflation is picking up too quickly, then it's telling you that demand is picking up ahead of supply. If it's too low and falling, then it's telling you need to loosen things because demand is below supply. You don't know what the supply side of the economy looks like. So having an inflation target is really important. Whether it's 2% or whether it's 3% or 1%, it doesn't matter that much. But what matters is credibly hitting on average that inflation target. So you can give households and businesses certainty and keep price stability, but also as a part of a way that you manage the economic cycle.
So, Paul, do you think the Reserve Bank can be more flexible, though, in its inflation targeting?
Well, it's already got some flexibility in the sense that it's a target range. It's a 1 to 3% target range with an indication that they should try to aim for the midpoint. But the idea of having the range is that you don't always have to be on target. You can't possibly always be on target. So that gives them some degree of flexibility already. But if you dig a little deeper, I guess the question is, you can't always be on target, and actually you can't always be in the target range. So the question then becomes, how quickly do you think the central bank needs to be moving back to target when it has gone out of the target range. And of course, we've seen a recent example of that with the pandemic and the positive shock to inflation. There's a question to be asked about how quickly inflation needs to get back to the target. And that allows a fair bit of flexibility, because in the end, that judgment is primarily made by the central bank itself, by the RBNZ. They have the scope to go hard with interest rates to get inflation down faster, or go a bit more slowly to get inflation down a bit more slowly. And it's that judgment is a feature of being a central bank policymaker.
Sabrina, how much of a handbrake do you think Stats NZ data is for the Reserve Bank, given the Reserve Bank is often looking at data in the rear view mirror?
Yeah, I mean, I think the data that we get here in New Zealand is quite a bit of a shocker compared to what you can get in other parts of the world. You know, Australia, the US, they all have monthly gauges of what inflation's doing, and here we're stuck with the quarterly data. And I think definitely having that sort of more frequent indicators would definitely help, you know, keep the momentum going, and for the Reserve Bank to really see how the economy is developing as it's happening, as opposed to one quarter behind.
And Sharon, if the Reserve Bank had more up-to-date data, do you think they could have cut earlier this year?
Well, I think obviously a policy mistake has been made. One of the positive benefits of inflation targeting is supposed to be that it smooths out the business cycle, that, you know, hot inflation means hot economy. You take the top off the boom and then take the bottom out of the bus. But because of forecasting errors, that really hasn't been the case in this cycle. So in that regard, yeah, I mean, any extra data is helpful, but the COVID period was just one out of the box. It was just nuts. And I mean, would it have made a difference if GDP was 17.3% or 17.5% lower than a quarter earlier? Probably not. And similarly for the inflation data. But I think we all made a mistake in terms of thinking that people would realise that the sky had fallen, that COVID was a bad thing. But in actual fact, I think we all underestimated the power of monetary policy. And I'm not convinced that more frequent inflation data would have changed that necessarily. But at the margin, of course, more data is always better than less.
You've changed your OCR view recently. What are you thinking now?
Yes, so the Reserve Bank's come up with some very clear comms in the last couple of days that a 50-point cut in February is the default, despite the fact that they published a track for the official cash rate that was actually pretty much on the fence between a 25 and a 50. But when you've got them all singing from the same hymn sheet, then I think you'd have to have quite different forecasts for the near-term data to not be picking a 50-point cut in February now. And actually, we are picking much the same for GDP and CPI and unemployment, which is the three big data reads that we'll get between now and February. So accordingly, we have brought forward our cuts slightly. So we have a third 50-point cut in February with a 25 basis point follow-up.
Do you think it was sensible for the Reserve Bank to be so clear in their communications in November?
Well, let's wait to see if they're right. Of course, if it turns out that they end up cutting only 25 in February because the data surprised them on the upside, then not. Then you'd have to say not. But if assuming they do end up cutting in February, then you know that clarity is useful.
Sabrina, what are your thoughts on the Reserve Bank's communication in recent weeks?
Yeah, so I guess, you know, we were really happy to see that another 50 basis points of cuts delivered. Maybe less happy to see that overall the end point of the track was moved a bit higher. We originally saw sort of the terminal rate ending at around 2.5%, but the Reserve Bank has sort of lifted their end point track to about 3.1%. So off the back of that, you know, we've changed our sort of forecast on the terminal rate to about 3% from 2.5%. But going forward for February, we're also on another 50 basis point cut. Again, a lot can happen between now and February. I mean, it's a whole season. But I think if the data sort of plays out how we expect it to and how the Reserve Bank is expecting it to, then a 50 basis point cut seems like the move to go.
And Paul, what are you thinking of the Reserve Bank's forecast track, i.e. inflation hovering in that 2 mark?
Well, we haven't changed anything in terms of our rates call after the Wednesday decision. We had expected the 50 basis point move. We have been projecting that the cash rate's going to get down to 3.25% by the end of 2025, 3% being the low point in early 2026. We haven't changed that either. And we're not at this point prepared to move our view on February yet. It's still too soon. The RBNZ saying that they might do something in 3 months' time from now, but as we all know, there's a lot of data that's yet to come between now and that next meeting. And actually, if you look at the data really closely, you're getting a bit of positive momentum already in things like the spending indicators, the business survey indicators, even some small signs in the housing market. So we're not prepared to move it. We've left it all as it is. I mean, our view for 25 is that, and again, it's not changed, is that the RBNZ has a very powerful monetary policy tool, that it was the primary thing that was slowing growth, pushing the economy into a downturn and getting inflation down. And now that it's moving quite quickly in the other direction, 125 basis points of cuts so far. You look around the world, that's one of the most substantial cuts we've seen across the developed world, much more than other central banks are doing. And we think it's going to feed through quite quickly. You're going to get a lift in growth in 2025. And that's why I think we're just a little bit hesitant to say, look, they're going to really keep going hard, because by the time we get to the next meeting in 3 months from now, we think the economy is going to start to show some signs of picking up. And yes, inflation is back at approximately the midpoint of the target band. But if the economy starts to pick up, then it might not necessarily drop that much further. And so, yeah, that's where we're at. There's going to be a slowdown in the pace of cuts from here.
Yeah, I agree with you about the upside risks and the positive momentum that we're seeing, which is why we only have the OCR being cut to 3.5% in our forecast. So quite an abrupt finish, actually, a third 50 and then a 25 and then done. Because, yeah, certainly our business survey, our consumer confidence survey, but not just those, but actually even physical transport indicators, there are definitely signs of a response to those lower rates out there.
And Sabrina, what could change that story in the months ahead if international inflation bounces around because of Trump?
Yeah, so as we kind of discussed, there is this upside and downside risk. The upside, there is that Trump inflation with who knows what kind of trade tariffs he's going to put in place and what that will actually mean. But there is definitely sort of a recent uprising in sort of this fear of Trumpflation. We've seen the 2-year swap rates pick back up off the back of since Trump has gotten elected. But then there is also the point that, we have had international prices, so imported inflation come off a lot faster than we expected. And imported inflation is running it's in deflation now. It's at negative 1.6%. And there is a risk now that, okay, so we're at 2.2%. If for some reason the domestic pressures here at home, the sticky stuff that we've been seeing, were to ease off a bit faster than we were expecting, then there is that risk that you're going sort of below 2%. But that's kind of what we're looking out for now, because we still have all these data points to sort of guide us through the coming months. We've got GDP, we've got the government's budget book update at the Haifu, we've got CPI, we've got the inflation expectations survey in February, which I think will be quite a key one, given that we saw a recent uptick in inflation expectations. So there's a lot to look out for, and definitely risks on either side.
How does the Reserve Bank navigate through that volatility then?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a managing act for them, and I think it is just them looking to each data point and weighing up the options. I think only right now we're in a position where only time will tell whether, the 50 that they've indicated is something that they can go through. I think, in the near term there is a lot of volatility, but it's about looking towards the medium term as well.
And Sharon, what are your thoughts on 25, the early part of the year?
On whether they'll go 25 in February. There's still absolutely a possibility if they get an upward surprise on any of the data. But given our forecasts for those big data prints are so similar, we're not actually forecasting any surprises, as it were, insofar as one can ever forecast a surprise. We're not expecting them to be surprised by the data, I suppose. So in that regard, a 50 has to become our new baseline. But it's not a slam dunk, not at all. The data, the economy surprises us all the time. The housing market is a particular one to watch. It has a huge impact on the vibe of how the consumer is feeling, for example, and there are some indicators that have picked up pretty strongly there. Not suggesting things are going to take off by any means. And we've got the debt to income limits in place to make sure that they don't at the end of the day. But yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty about how stimulatory interest rates are at the moment. The Reserve Bank had a whole section in their monetary policy statement about the neutral official cash rate and why they really are not certain where it is at all. So we're all in wait and see mode at the end of the day.
And Paul, you're watching Trump?
Oh, of course, we're watching the global picture. We always do. And I think, the way I think about it is there's likely to be big change, but also there's considerable uncertainty about how it's gonna work and what's going to happen. It looks like the larger collection of what is likely to be delivered could potentially be inflationary for the US economy. But then there's a question about what that means for the rest of the global economy as well. Is it inflationary overall? Or does it actually possibly mean some disinflation in other places? So yeah, we're watching it, of course, very, very carefully. And I think to the point that we've been talking through, I mean, you can think about the next 6 months. Typically, that's my rule of thumb, usually for Australia and New Zealand. You can sort of really think about the next 6 months as being guided primarily by the momentum you've got in the domestic economy. But when you want to take a view on what's going to happen a bit further out than that, you've really got to have a sort of a view on what's happening globally and what those forces are going to look like. And I think we're in a particularly uncertain environment at the moment in terms of what that global environment's going to look like.
And that's where the strength of the target band comes into play.
Absolutely. I'm a firm believer that we've developed both in Australia and New Zealand, gravitating towards having an inflation target, and having an inflation target that's credible is the best way to go about setting policy, given all of the various uncertainties there are about the global and the local picture. And we can, as we did earlier, have a discussion about the precise nature of the way you approach that target and how you respond and what the level is and how quickly you think you need to get back to target and so on. But the principle of having a flexible inflation targeting regime, I think, has proven to be the best system that we can use in terms of managing the cycle for both of these economies.
I'll just add to that. Sorry, I was going to add to that. One of the most interesting learnings of the last few years for me has just been how much people hate inflation, which I think goes a long way to explaining why we have inflation targeting to begin with and why it is so political. In 2021, for example, the housing market was booming, the employment was booming, we had positive real wage growth, but nonetheless, as inflation took off, consumer confidence absolutely tanked. And it's only really coming back now as inflation is falling. So you'd think logically people would care much more about unemployment and job security and their real wages. But no, there just seems to be a pretty visceral hatred of inflation. And of course, that was why politicians voluntarily gave up the ability to control interest rates, which is a heck of a superpower to give up, the ability to juice the economy just before an election. But it was because time had shown that they couldn't be trusted with it. It would lead to inflation, and that wasn't a good outcome in the long run.
Sharon, Sabrina and Paul, thanks for your time. The founder of the Spinoff, Duncan Greaves, says the company was potentially too reliant on public money to fund its operations, as it calls for donations to help keep the business afloat. For a look at the nuts and bolts, here's senior journalist Nicholas Pointed.
Digital media company The Spinoff is ringing the financial alarm bells as it's issued an open letter calling for donations to help keep the company afloat. Well, Duncan, I was wondering if we could start off with how has the company found itself in this position?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's not one that anyone would sort of set out to end up in, but I think it's really a kind of a parable of what a lot of media companies have gone through over the past few years, in that the sort of, advertising used to be by far the largest funder of news media in New Zealand and around the world, and that was our only revenue stream up until 2019 when we launched members, and advertising is notoriously correlated with the broader economy. And the fact that the economy is in a tough state means that advertising has come back. The thing that was sort of a bit unexpected for us was we have, for a while now, been successful in creating content funded by New Zealand On Air, part of their sort of decentralised public media remit, and for the first time in a while have been unsuccessful there as well. So those two things coming in concert got us into a situation where we thought actually we need to sort of be quite upfront with our audience about our status and give them the opportunity to kind of step in and help us out of this hole.
Beginning with that NZ On Air part of this, has the Spinoff become maybe too reliant on that funding as part of its part of its operating model?
Potentially, I think it's as with anything that I think what I like to say about media funding models is that they're all bad, and you've just got to pick the least worst. If you have a pure audience model, you can be prone to ideological capture. If you have a pure advertising model, you can be over-reliant on that or create content that maps to that. And certainly with New Zealand On Air, you can find yourself making projects that are more what it wants you to make than what you might make naturally. So there is no perfect model for funding media. But, for a while there and in sort of economic peacetime, it seemed to work pretty well that we'd make a few New Zealand On Air projects a year that our audience would like. We'd have our sort of core business that was kind of part ad funded, part audience funded, and it felt like it worked. But you realise, I guess to your point, how reliant you are on one of those legs of the stool when it disappears.
Did you sort of not necessarily foresee that? Did you sort of expect that those projects would be able to continually get funding? Did you just not sort of expect that applications could be rejected?
Well, we're very used to applications being rejected. I think the best way to think about New Zealand On Air is as a government procurement process, but where the government knows it wants something, it doesn't know exactly what, so you end up kind of bidding to create content for your platform and your audience and things that you'd like to make, and you're sort of on some level guessing at what they will think makes sense for you in an overall content sort of strategy. And because we'd had so many years of being successful in that, not with everything, we probably had about a 25-30% hit rate, but you do start to think, well, we're part of that fortunate group that New Zealand On Air likes to work with, and certainly there was no foreseeing it in the sense that our audience has actually been incredibly robust. November was actually the best month we've had for audience since sort of peak COVID. So, even outdoing last year's election, which is normally a very high traffic time. So, it was very unexpected, and I guess it does sort of suggest that there is definitely a vulnerability once you have that as part of your sort of forecasts and projections, that you will get something there without knowing quite what it is.
Is the business interested or considered introducing a paywall? That seems like a pretty clear-cut way you could try and monetize what seems to be quite a large audience.
Yeah, I mean, we've absolutely toyed with the idea. We had a bit of a fork in the road in 2019 when we first introduced the Spinoff members, which is probably closer to a Guardian type model where you fund something that is, that you want to see in the world. And certainly the paywall model is a better financial model. Like I wouldn't disagree with that, and I think you've seen that in the local market with, the NBR was probably the original, but the Herald has done very well with it, sort of subsequent to their launch in 2019, just a month prior to us. I think one of the paradoxes of it is that once you put up a paywall, your content is naturally bound by as many people as subscribe to your product, whereas any journalist will tell you when you publish a really great story, you want as many people as possible to read it, and that's the thing. We're trying to, on some level, have our cake and eat it too by having audience revenue tantamount to a paywall, but also keeping the gates open. And like I said, to this point, it's got us along reasonably well. We're still not giving up on the model by any means, and we've been gratified by the early stages of the response to our appeal. But there is something about when you put up a paywall, it really does sharpen the mind in terms of what is something that people are willing to pay to access. And I think that is the way of a lot of the internet now, is it no longer wants to be free, it wants to be paid for.
Just reflecting on the recent years of the Spinoff, it's obviously celebrated its 10th birthday this year, but are there things that you think back that you kind of wished the company had done or business had done that may have set it up in a better financial position to the one it finds itself in now?
I mean, I don't think any business person would or anyone credible would say that they have got no elements or decisions they've made that they don't sort of think back on and imagine how they might have gone differently if they'd taken a different path. And I do think about the paywall as one of those, you know, and probably, you know, to your earlier point about how we related to New Zealand On Air, I think, you know, had we done so in a way that was kind of perhaps more targeted and kept closer to the very core of what it is we do, rather than the sort of more expansive approach we took where we worked with independent production companies. On some level, we were replicating the way that the TV networks approach New Zealand On Air in a digital context, which was something they were very keen on us doing. And some of our competitors, most notably the likes of Newsroom, kept a strategy that was more about making it themselves. And you know, with hindsight, it'd be interesting to see how another approach played out. Like I'm very proud of the content we've made. It's been very popular, but in terms of its core connection to us or the business outcomes it drove, I think that is maybe less clear about whether it's worked out. You've
obviously launched this sort of donations push late last week. I think I read in the open letter that you want to double it from about, you know, it's going from about 9,000 donors to about maybe, you know, roughly 18,000. What has been the response since you've opened it up towards the end of last week?
We opened it up on Thursday, and the last figures I have are sort of Friday afternoon. I'm not at liberty to share the sort of early figures, but I will say that there was a world where we made this appeal and it sort of instantly revealed itself as not having worked. Or not likely to work, and we were sort of forced to contemplate a much more kind of serious situation. I think it's fair to say that the scale of the response has been really gratifying, and like we're going to be working on this for months, if not longer, but it feels achievable now with continual effort and communication, and that is probably more than we would have hoped for when we sort of, you know, set off the cannons on Thursday morning. So, you know, that's on that level we're really gratified by the response.
Want a definitive Christmas guide to Australian politics? Look no further than NBR's Underarm column this week, as our Australian correspondent Lachlan Cahoon attempts to get to the guts of the situation so NBR readers and viewers don't have to.
It's been a big year for politics, with changes of power in the UK and the US at the top of a long list. Australia is almost the next cab off the rank, with the next federal election due in May next year. NBR's Sydney correspondent is wrapping up Aussie politics in his Underarm column this week and joins me now. Lachlan, where have the parties ended up as they head off on their Christmas break?
Hi, Mike. Yeah, what I'm trying to do in the column this week is produce the definitive Christmas guide to Australian politics, so that NBR readers don't have to read anything else about Australian politics over the Christmas period. They can read my column and they'll be fully up to date. So in this wrap up, the parties ended the year pretty much neck and neck. We have a preferential system, but on a two-party preferred vote in the mainly watched news poll, the Coalition, which is the Liberal and National Party, the centre-right politics, they're slightly ahead with 51% of the vote versus Labor on 49%. So that's according to the last news poll conducted in November. According to the primary vote, the situation is a bit different. The coalition 40% and Labor only 33%. But the Greens, and we'll talk about them in a minute, they're polling at 11%. They're the largest third party. And this is what gives Labor hope and makes them competitive, because most Green voters, even though they say they hate Labor, they'll preference Labor over the coalition. So most of those 11% of Green voters will effectively be voting for Labor when it comes down to it.
51 to 49, that is tight. Well, Lachlan, how do you assess the trajectory of the Albanese government?
Mike, it's been in two halves. There was a very long honeymoon, very long indeed. Only 18 months ago, there was an unprecedented swing of 6% to the government in a by-election, and they took a seat off the Liberals. I mean, this is almost unheard of. In almost every by-election, the incumbent government has a swing against it. But the real watershed was the Voice referendum last year. This was a referendum nationally on an Indigenous recognition of Indigenous Australians in the National Constitution, and also the creation of a consultative body on Indigenous affairs called the Voice. Now, Albanese invested a significant amount of his own personal political capital in that. He lost very badly. There was a 60% no vote against him, and that was really the turning point. He's been under attack since, and he's been on the defensive. He hasn't helped himself. He bought a $4.3 million holiday home in the middle of a housing crisis, which didn't help his brand. It wasn't a good look. And he really does seem to have been scared since that Voice setback to take any kind of initiative. So he's become a very slow-moving target, and the opposition have delighted in attacking him on many fronts since then.
Yeah, OK. Well, let's take a look at the opposition. Have they actually clawed their way back into contention here?
They have. When the opposition lost that by-election, everybody said that Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, was finished. He'd never be prime minister. Now he's, they are at 51% against 49% on a two-party preferred vote. So there's a very real chance that he will become prime minister. So they played really the cost of living card. It's been a bit sort of similar to the Republicans in the US. Are you any better off today than you were, in our case, 3 years ago rather than 4? So there's housing and energy costs. What they say is the government's failed renewable energy agenda, and also going very hard on immigration. They say the government's soft on immigration, which is quite an unpopular issue. And they say that, and also they say the government is very less than full-throated in its support for Israel. I don't think that that's necessarily a big vote winner, but that's another attack point. So they're playing the man, really, as in attacking Albanese, letting him make his mistakes while not really offering any policy, apart from an uncosted plan on nuclear energy. And we're going to get the costings on those soon. So that's really the only major policy initiative they've had. Everything else has been to sit back, be negative, and let Labor and Albanese make the mistakes.
Well, we've seen enough on our screens over here from Australia to know that the environment is obviously going to be a big issue too. What role do you think the Greens will play?
They're going to be really, really, really critical here. Even though Labor has spent most of their time trashing the Greens while they've been in government, they really need their preferences if they're going to succeed. And the Greens really, they've just played a key role in passing more than 40 pieces of legislation in the Senate, where the Greens effectively have the ability to block legislation. They have the balance of power there. This legislation has been stuck there for most of the term. Now they've managed to pass it. This is major housing legislation on childcare. What they didn't pass was were plans for an environmental protector's office, and that's going to be controversial. They parked that until after the election, largely because I think the government are terrified that if they passed it, they'd lose votes in Western Australia, which is a big mining state. And if they were to pass that legislation, it'd probably provoke a huge campaign from the mining industry. In terms of the Greens, their support has been eroding. They did very poorly in the recent Queensland state election, and I think they've been scared to be painted as sort of negative and obstructionist. So we have an interesting prospect here, Mike. Labor and the Greens hate each other, but Labor may be forced into approaching the Greens to be in a minority government after the election, depending on how the votes fall. So they've said most of the are desperately trying to be as centrist as possible. That's the Labor Party. But if they have to form a government with the Greens, they're going to be pulled irrevocably to the left, which is not really what Labor wants to do, and perhaps that's not what the voters want either. And that's what Peter Dutton's going to be saying to voters in the run-up to the election. He'll be saying, if you vote for Albanese, you'll get the Greens. Government's going to be pulled to the left. Vote for us. We're the sensible sort of alternative.
Finally this week, the road less travelled, from caskets to caravans. Travel Light Joint Managing Director Sean Newman sits down with Kate McVicker to talk family business and future growth.
Business was started in 1954 in a cabinet maker's factory on the other side of Pukekohe. The owners of the business saw some caravans around on the road and thought it was the kind of thing that they could build for themselves for their summer holidays. They built a couple of caravans, one for each of the owners, took them away, brought them back, parked them out the front, and they had people asking if they could build those caravans for them. They sold them, built some more, and then really the business was started from that. It was a long process. My father joined the business in the early 70s, and even at that point they were still building furniture, building caskets and really just whatever the local community wanted. And then I guess not long after that it became less popular to ask a cabinet maker to build a piece of furniture for you at the same time that caravanning was becoming really strong, and so I think that transition towards becoming caravan manufacturers first was pretty natural. Around the 80s, motorhomes became a bit more of a thing, and so for the business that transition again was kind of natural. That caravans started to die off. Motorhomes became more popular, and so that's where the big focus for the business has been primarily more recently. In terms of the product itself, of course, it's just gotten so much more sophisticated. An old caravan was pretty basic, really. It was a bed and some furniture, and these days people are looking for all the luxuries of home. They want to go away, they want to be able to charge the e-bikes, they want to use the coffee machine and the hair straighteners, they want to be able to watch TV, have Wi-Fi inside the vehicles, and they really want to do everything on the road as if they were at home. They don't want to run out of power or water or anything like that, and so the specification of the vehicles has increased accordingly, and the ability for you to go off the beaten track and to have everything that you're used to having has increased as well. Most of our customers are baby boomers, so they're people who have recently retired generally or are preparing for retirement. So maybe they've got themselves in a working position, they're not having to work as much, or the kids have moved out of home, or they've recently sold the business or something like that, and so they have this added time, and maybe they've sold an asset that can fund the purchase of a motorhome. So that's traditionally who our customers have been, but we are seeing a trend towards younger people getting into motorhomes, families and that kind of thing as well. So we do see a lot of people maybe downsizing the house, freeing up a bit of equity that goes into the motorhome. A lot of people who are selling a holiday house to buy a motorhome, or maybe moving into a retirement village or something like that. And there are also a number of people who sell the house and then they choose to live in the motorhome as well. Didn't really have a lot of interest in the business until I was in my 30s, and I think I looked at it from afar in my 30s and thought, hey, wow, this is actually a really good business that our fathers built, and could see that there was a huge amount of potential. I was studying for a Bachelor of Business part-time. I was enjoying that, and I think it was at the same time my father was looking to ease up himself a little bit and start thinking about his retirement, and so he asked me to join the business, and I was pretty excited about doing that. And so a few years after that, my other brother Adam also joined us as well. Dad had built a business that had really great products, had a really excellent reputation. He was looking after his customers really well. The opportunities to add more systems to the business, improve the marketing, adopt technology, and those kinds of things was the opportunity that we could see. Most of the products we compete against are coming in from Europe, and they're from manufacturers that are building in a day what we would build in a year, have R&D teams the size of our entire business. And so we decided a long time ago that we weren't going to be able to compete on price, and so we deliberately decided to target the premium end of the market. And so for us, it's about giving people a fit and finish that you just can't get in a mass-produced product, giving people an opportunity to customise the product to their lifestyle. So there's a really huge options list that people can choose from so they can get it exactly the way that they want it. And really just about giving people a more premium product so that we're not competing on volume or on price or anything like that. I think it's really looking towards the size of the opportunity that we have. We're pretty ambitious in terms of what we want to achieve. We think there's a lot of potential, and it may be just considering that as part of those growth plans, speeding things up. It's just new products in parts of the market that we're not currently in. And so I said that we're currently in the premium end of the market, which is great. That's worked really well for us. We've built a really good reputation. We now think that there's an opportunity for us to take that reputation that we've built and the experience that we have and put it into another part of the market that we're not currently active in. Something that's a little bit cheaper than what we currently do, where the specification is a little bit lower, maybe you don't have quite as much choice, but that is going to suit most people for what they're looking for. Biggest challenge for us was probably during the GFC. Where not only did sales just disappear overnight, but we had a lot of customers who lost money in finance companies, and so a lot of their forward orders that we had, those people just cancelled their orders as well, and so we went in a very short time frame from having a 1 year lead time to effectively having nothing at all, and we really didn't know what we were building the next day. And we'd recently just moved into this building. We'd been through a period of growth, we'd added a whole lot of people, and so that was a particularly challenging time for us and a particularly challenging time for our industry. We came out of the GFC, we went into the GFC, and I think there was probably about 10 local manufacturers, and we came out of it and we were the only ones left standing, unfortunately.
And you can read Kate's written feature online now, along with our extensive archive of your business and entrepreneur profiles. Well, that's it for this week. Thanks again for joining us. The news team is back from 5 a.m. tomorrow with the latest business news and analysis you can use on mbr.co.nz, and join our very own Mike McRoberts from 5:30 p.m. tomorrow for a look at the day's top stories. See you next week.